I'm calling this next series of clips the C.J. Hadley Challenge series. It's a series of 3 short clips putting a wrap on the Oregon Standoff trial. The first clip is intended to be a wrap-up of the entire case. The second clip is intended to be a discussion of the major takeaways from the case. And the third clip is going to be a discussion of the comparisons between what happened in Oregon and what's going on in North Dakota right now. So this first clip isn't a recap, it's a wrap-up. It's a wrap-up of the entire case, and we're going to do that as short, sweet, and to the point with as little redundancy as possible. So I want to go back and compare the case to an analogy I've used before, which is a 6-ring circus. And the 6 rings in that circus are, first of all, the prosecution, then the defense, then the judge, the jury, the media, and the general American public. And I want to start talking about, right from the outset, the general public in this country. And I've stated before, and I think it's still the case, that at least 80% of the people across the country don't know anything about the case. Don't really know, don't really care. But that still leaves 20% who are very passionate on both sides of the equation. This has been a very polarizing case. There's no question about that. We'll talk more about that in the next clip. The second ring in the circus is the prosecution. And to put the prosecution in a nutshell, I think that they did a very good job presenting the evidence that they had. At the end of the day, the jury found that the government had not met its burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendants in the case had engaged in a conspiratorial agreement with a primary purpose or objective of impeding or interfering with federal government officials. That's it in a nutshell. The government failed to meet its burden of proof. So the defense. I'm going to put that one in a nutshell as well. By many accounts, momentum in the case turned when Ammon Bundy took the stand. He was on the stand for the better part of 3 days. And in comparison to all the evidence that the government put on, it wasn't until Ammon Bundy took the stand that any real evidence was presented as to the primary purposes and objectives of the defendants in the case. And Ammon Bundy testified that the reason he went to Oregon, the whole reason he was there in Harney County, in Burns, was to support the Hammonds. He went there to support the Hammonds. That support ultimately culminated in a protest in Burns. And then when nothing else seemed to be accomplished, he said that they were going to take a hard stand by going to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and they were going to stake an adverse possession claim there. Even Ryan Bundy admitted that one of the effects or consequences of the actions they took might have been to actually impede or interfere with federal officers. But at the end of the day, there was no evidence presented that a primary purpose or objective of the defendants was to engage in a conspiracy to impede or interfere with federal officers, and that was the charge. That was the primary charge. The firearms charge was contingent upon finding the defendants guilty of conspiracy. And so once the jury found that they were not guilty of the conspiracy charge, then the firearms charge went away automatically. That basically sums up the defense. Then we've got the judge, and I'm going to keep it really short and sweet about the judge. I think in a nutshell, she did everything in her power to stack the deck against the defendants. I think it would be really interesting to hear what the jury's impressions and perceptions of Judge Brown were in the trial, and if they would size it up the same way I do. Then we've got the jury, and really that's an area that we can spend a lot more time talking about at this point in time, because last time I talked about this, we had no idea what they were thinking. The jury was a complete mystery. Well, they're not a mystery anymore. They've had some drama. One of the jury members was dismissed based on his statement at the outset of jury deliberations that he was very biased. We had another juror who questioned whether or not he could be an impartial judge of the case given his statement that he was very biased, and that was based on the fact that he had previously worked for the BLM and that he's a current law enforcement officer employed by the Department of Corrections. It leaves us all scratching our heads how a person like that got on the jury to start with. But then that brings us to the media, the fifth ring in the circus. And the media has really made, especially the final wrap-up, the verdict, a true circus, because they are in shock about what's happened. And I think the best way to explain that is just the fact that they have not been able to size up the merits of this case from the beginning. From the very beginning of the case, and especially by the time the prosecution had rested, I've been stating that the government put on a very weak and marginal case. But apparently, the mainstream media has not ever been able to figure that out. And so by the time the jury came back and said that the government had failed to meet its burden of proof, that came as a complete shock to the mainstream media, and they haven't known what to do about it, and they've tried to explain that 6 ways from Sunday, and they just haven't been able to come up with enough excuses as to how and why that could possibly happen. So again, brings us back to the public. And they, again, are all over the map, across the spectrum. But one other thing I want to talk about before I end this clip is what happened to Marcus Mumford at the very end. As most people know, when he argued that Ammon Bundy should be released based on the not guilty verdict, he ended up getting in an argument with Judge Brown, and as a result of that, he was tackled by U.S. Marshals. He was tased in the courtroom. And I think, just so that people kind of understand, my assessment of what happened is that the jury's verdict came as such a... First of all, it came before anyone was expecting it. Secondly, it was not what they expected. I think Judge Brown, the court, everybody involved, just like the mainstream media, fully expected that it would go the other direction. And so I don't think they were prepared that there might be a not guilty verdict. And when that ended up being the case, they did not have paperwork in place. This is just my speculation. They did not have paperwork in place to continue to hold Ammon Bundy in custody once he was found not guilty. So attorney Marcus Mumford challenged them on that and asked to see the paperwork that would justify continuing to hold Ammon Bundy in custody as opposed to releasing him. And when neither the U.S. Marshals nor the judge were able to produce any paperwork that would justify continuing to hold him in custody, he was taken to the ground, he was tackled, and he was tased. And I think that's what happened in a nutshell. I'll come back in the next clip and we'll talk about the major takeaways in the entire case.